For 2 millennia, the name Judas Iscariot has served as Western civilization's ultimate synonym for treason. It is a story designed to be simple, the good betrayed by the greedy. But history is rarely simple, and the story that survived is almost never the only one that was told. Tonight, we peel back the layers of dogma to reveal a version of the gospel that was once commonplace, yet became the subject of a systematic, state-sponsored campaign of annihilation. A gospel that insists Judas was not the serpent, but the key to Christ's spiritual triumph. The discovery began in secrecy and chaos. In 1978, in a dry cavern near the Nile River, a sealed stone box yielded the Codex Tchacos. But this was not the quiet, reverent unearthing that scholars dream of. It was the start of a decades-long nightmare. The Codex was a collection of papyrus sheets written in the ancient Coptic language. It fell immediately into the hands of illegal antiquities dealers. For 20 years, this priceless artifact, the only known copy of the Gospel of Judas, suffered unimaginable abuse. It was exposed to humidity, improperly stored in bank vaults, and handled carelessly. By the time it was finally acquired by preservationists in the early 2000s, the manuscript was nothing more than thousands of brittle, flaking shards. The restoration, a global effort led by Dr. Rodolphe Casa, was an act of scholarly resuscitation. The resulting publication in 2006 confirmed the worst fears of orthodox historians. A fully formed, coherent alternative Christianity existed at the very dawn of the faith. To grasp the revolutionary nature of the Gospel of Judas, we must first dive deep into the philosophy that created it: Gnosticism. Gnosticism, derived from the Greek word for knowledge, was a potent intellectual force in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Unlike the nascent Orthodox movement, which emphasized faith, obedience, and the belief in a God who created the physical world, Gnosticism believed the universe was a catastrophic error. Their cosmology was complex and profoundly pessimistic. They taught that beyond our visible universe resided the true, transcendent God, the pleroma, or fullness of light. This God did not create Earth. The Earth and all physical matter were the result of a cosmic mishap, a flawed creation brought forth by a lesser, arrogant deity known as the demiurge. This demiurge, often identified with the wrathful, legalistic God of the Old Testament, believed he was the only God, thereby trapping human souls, each containing a spark of the pleroma, in the prison of the physical body. Salvation, therefore, could not be attained by worshipping the demiurge through ritual, nor by faith alone. It was attained only through Gnosis, secret knowledge delivered by Jesus, the emissary from the pleroma, who came to remind the trapped souls of their divine origin. For Gnostics, the body was not a temple. It was a tomb. The ultimate goal was escape. This is the lens through which we must read the confrontation that begins the Gospel of Judas. The inevitable conflict between the Gnostic Christ and his disciples begins not with a whisper, but with a searing, profound act of disrespect towards their tradition. The Gospel of Judas, setting the scene on the eve of the Passover, describes Jesus approaching his 12 disciples. They are engaged in a familiar, solemn act of worship, offering a sacrifice and presenting their thanks to the divine. In the world they understood, this was the highest expression of piety. And yet, Jesus' reaction is an existential repudiation of their actions. The text reports with jarring simplicity, "He laughed." This laughter is the critical hinge upon which the entire narrative pivots. It is not the gentle, forgiving chuckle of the canonical Christ. It is the laughter of cosmic intelligence witnessing profound, self-imposed delusion. It is the scorn of an enlightened emissary, viewing his students performing rituals that anchor them deeper into the prison he came to liberate them from. This single act of scorn immediately establishes the Gnostic Christ as fundamentally different, a figure who demands radical spiritual revolution, not comfortable continuity. The disciples, humiliated and perplexed by this public mockery, are forced to confront him. They are the chosen ones, the future pillars of the faith, and their authority is being dismantled in real time. They ask, their wounded pride evident in their question, "Master, why do you laugh at our prayer? What is wrong with what we are doing?" Jesus' reply is the ultimate theological declaration of war against the emerging orthodox system. He strikes at the very root of their worship. "I am not laughing at you, but at your error. You are worshipping the wrong God." This line carries the entire weight of Gnostic philosophy. Jesus is telling the apostles that the entity they are directing their sacrifice and reverence toward is not the true, supreme Father, the God of the Pleroma. Instead, they are elevating the demiurge, the arrogant, ignorant, and flawed creator of the material world. Their sacrifice, far from being a path to salvation, is a continuation of their bondage, an act of homage to the very cosmic jailer they need to escape. The text records the apostles' reaction not as contrition, but as profound anger and stubborn defensiveness. They become vexed and angry, and they muttered blasphemies against him in their hearts. Their inability to accept the condemnation demonstrates their complete spiritual blindness. Their allegiance is to the forms of religion, to the ritual, to the organization, and to the authority that these practices grant them. They cannot abandon the structure they believe grants them power. This moment creates the necessary distinction between the spiritually deaf collective and the one disciple capable of receiving true gnosis. In the midst of this furious confusion, only one figure is noted for his poise. The text notes that Judas Iscariot is the only one who can withstand Jesus' gaze without flinching, demonstrating an intellectual and spiritual honesty that sets him apart. Jesus immediately uses this moment to lay out the spiritual futility of the path the apostles are currently on. He speaks directly to the consequences of their adherence to the demiurge's religion. "I tell you the truth, none of you will ever know me. You will never know the one who sent me. But you will found churches, and they will follow my name for a time, yet they will be consumed by the fire of the archons." This is a prophetic denunciation that strikes at the heart of the future church's legitimacy. Jesus predicts that the institution the apostles will establish, the early church, the bishops, the structure will be fundamentally flawed. They will use his name, but they will be spiritually bankrupt, destined to be corrupted and destroyed by the archons, the malevolent cosmic rulers who enforce the law of the demiurge and maintain the material prison. The political implications of this speech are devastating. The emerging Orthodox Church, which would eventually become the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox faiths, built its entire foundation on the apostolic succession, the unbroken chain of authority running from Jesus to the 12 and then from the 12 to the bishops. The Gospel of Judas tears that chain apart. It claims the apostles were ignorant, arrogant, and founded an institution that was fundamentally misguided. This is why the Gospel of Judas was deemed not merely a theological difference, but an existential political threat that had to be eliminated entirely. It is only after this comprehensive condemnation of the collective that Jesus pulls Judas aside for the ultimate, private instruction. This intimacy emphasizes Judas's unique, singular status. He is not just another student, he is the designated recipient of the truth that the others were too spiritually primitive to grasp. Jesus then begins the secret teaching, elevating Judas above all his peers. "Step away from the others, and I will tell you the mysteries of the kingdom. You will exceed all of them." This promise to exceed all of them, including Peter and John, is the complete inversion of the established moral universe. Judas is anointed as the true heir to Christ's knowledge. And then, the command that redefines the entire history of salvation, "For you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." This command is the final theological split between the two Christianities. For the canonical church, the Passion was a public, painful, substitutionary sacrifice. Jesus, the man, died to atone for humanity's sins. This requires faith and ritual. For the Gnostic Church, the Passion was a private, necessary, liberatory act. Jesus, the divine spirit, required the dissolution of his physical shell, the man that clothes me, to escape the material prison. This requires knowledge and action. Judas's role, therefore, is not that of a sinner motivated by avarice, but of the celestial accomplice, the agent tasked with carrying out the singular, crucial task of setting the divine spirit free. He is not betraying the master, he is completing the master's mission. The 30 pieces of silver, if accepted at all in this context, are merely the required functional mechanism for facilitating this liberation, a means to an end, not a motive for sin. This is the truth that the institutional church found unforgivable and had to bury forever. With the command delivered, the theological fissure between the two Christianities becomes absolute. The Gnostic view of Judas transforms the act of betrayal from a sin of greed into a spiritual act of cosmic necessity. Let us examine the staggering contrast. The canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, unanimously describe Judas as being motivated by the despicable figure of 30 pieces of silver. In that narrative, the money is the sole motive. Judas's heart is ruled by avarice. The amount is pathetic, underscoring the spiritual cheapness of his soul. His inevitable fate is despair and a horrific suicide, as recorded in Matthew, leading to his eternal damnation. The institutional church needed this version of Judas. They needed him to be a simple, clear villain so that the sacrificial atonement, the core doctrine of the orthodox faith, could be validated. If Christ's suffering was a painful substitutionary payment for sin, then the person who facilitated that suffering must be the personification of that sin, a vessel for Satan. The Gospel of Judas annihilates this entire moral framework. The issue is no longer sin, it is spiritual physics. Judas is not motivated by money, but by Gnosis. He is obeying the explicit private command, "Sacrifice the man that clothes me." His act is not one of disobedience, but of supreme service. The physical transaction of the silver, if it occurred at all, is merely the functional trigger required to set the political and military machinery in motion, thus fulfilling the divine mandate of liberation. In this light, the canonical texts take on a new, darker meaning. When John's Gospel states, "Then after the morsel Satan entered into him," the Gnostics saw this as a deliberate act of historical slander by the later disciples. In the Gnostic view, Judas was possessed not by the devil, but by ultimate knowledge. He was operating at a level of spiritual authority far beyond the carnal understanding of the other 11. This elevation of Judas is the central, unforgivable offense that guaranteed the burning of the Codex. By making Judas the most enlightened, the Gospel effectively nullifies the apostolic succession, the unbroken chain of authority flowing from Peter to the bishops of Rome. If Judas is the rightful spiritual heir, then the entire structure of the institutional church is built on the word of those Jesus specifically mocked and deemed inadequate. The text continues its prophetic censure by returning to the 11. Still angered and confused by the condemnation of their worship, they attempt to salvage their spiritual standing by sharing a vivid, symbolic dream they experienced. The dream is a clear vision of the future. Church, 12 priests representing the 12 apostles are gathered around an altar. They are competing fiercely, trampling upon each other in their zeal to get to the altar and polluting the offerings with their own defilement. This dream exposes the apostles' ambition, rivalry, and their focus on outward ritual rather than inner truth. Jesus, who has already confirmed their error, interprets the dream with devastating precision. The 12 priests you saw are those whom you lead. They are those whom you have gone astray after. This is not a symbolic warning about external enemies. It is a direct internal prophecy. Jesus is telling the apostles that the religious establishment they are poised to found will be intrinsically corrupt. The priests, bishops, and future leaders will be driven by power struggles and false ritualism, perpetually worshipping the demiurge, the false god of the material world. This moment further solidifies the Gnostic view that the institutionalization of Christianity was the great spiritual error. The Gnostic Jesus viewed religious organization with its need for temples, priests, and obedience as the very mechanism by which the archons, the cosmic jailers, would maintain control over the human soul. While the other disciples see only earthly power, Judas is granted the full, terrifying vision of the cosmic order that he must confront. He is shown the structures of control that Jesus came to dismantle. He sees a great crowd of stars, the misguided leaders, the archons of the world, and the ships sailing upon the waters. This is the Gnostic version of the apocalypse, a vision of the forces of spiritual imprisonment. The archons are the rulers. The misguided leaders are the corrupted clergy, and the ships sailing upon the waters is the definitive Gnostic metaphor for the rigid, linear, and predictable nature of the established church. It follows set routes, is constrained by organizational structure, and stands in stark opposition to the free, chaotic, and fluid movement of the true spirit. The Gospel of Judas, through this vision, becomes the ultimate theological manifesto against church hierarchy. It states, in effect, that if you follow the church, you are following the demiurge. If you follow Judas, you are following Christ. This sustained prophetic condemnation is what made the Gospel of Judas so uniquely dangerous. It was not merely a differing opinion, it was an act of theological mutiny. It challenged the entire basis of the emerging faith's authority, ritual, and concept of God. By celebrating the traitor and condemning the saints, the book left the institutional power structure with no choice but absolute, violent suppression. The narrative then moves swiftly to the conclusion of Judas's mission. Having received the Gnosis and the divine command, Judas must now fulfill his terrifying purpose. The culmination of the Gospel of Judas is intentionally anticlimactic. Having received the Gnosis and the direct command to facilitate the spiritual liberation, Judas proceeds with the transaction with a clinical detachment that underscores the metaphysical, not the material, nature of the act. The narrative shifts from the secretive conversation between Jesus and Judas back to the outside world. Judas approaches the chief priests, the agents of the demiurge's law, and finalizes the deal. The Coptic text is brief and devoid of moral commentary when describing the handover, and Judas received money and handed him over to them. This concise ending is a masterstroke of theological opposition. What is most critical here is not what the text includes, but what it omits. Every canonical account of the betrayal is immediately followed by Judas's profound and violent remorse. In the Gospel of Matthew, Judas is consumed by guilt, returns the silver, and commits suicide by hanging. In the book of Acts, he falls and bursts open. These canonical endings are essential to the orthodox message. They confirm Judas's damnation, providing the moral closure necessary for his role as the ultimate villain. But in the Gospel of Judas, all signs of regret, guilt, and self-punishment are entirely absent. The act of receiving the money and handing over Jesus is treated as the simple, necessary fulfillment of a divine task. There is no suicide because the mission was a success, not a failure. Instead of damnation, the prophecy of Jesus for Judas remains: he will rule over the generations. The Gnostic Judas is not a figure of eternal shame, but a figure of unique spiritual glory. This is a deliberate, frontal assault on the narrative integrity of the four canonical Gospels. It means that to believe in the Gospel of Judas is to deny the spiritual authority of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The early institutional church recognized this threat immediately. This was not a minor doctrinal dispute about the nature of the Holy Spirit. This was a fundamental challenge to the very legitimacy of the men who claimed to speak for God. If Judas was the true heir, then the foundation laid by Peter was an error. The resulting conflict was a war fought with rhetoric, excommunication, and eventually the power of the Roman state. One of the most vocal opponents was Saint Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, writing his magnum opus against heresies around 180 AD. Irenaeus was the primary architect of the four-gospel canon and the champion of apostolic succession. His goal was to centralize Christian authority and doctrine. Irenaeus was compelled to attack the Gospel of Judas because its followers, the Cainites, a Gnostic sect, celebrated Judas precisely for his betrayal. They argued that since the physical world was evil and since Jesus sought liberation from his body, anyone who helped hasten that event was a hero. Irenaeus condemns the Cainites' text as a wicked and impious fiction and a poisonous concoction designed by Satan to subvert the faithful. He understood that the Gospel of Judas was the ultimate tool for decentralization. It empowered the individual seeker and discredited the priest. The political nature of the suppression became absolute in the 4th century. After Constantine legalized Christianity, the church merged with the state, creating a need for ironclad doctrinal and political uniformity across the vast Roman Empire. A Gnostic Jesus, a Christ who laughed at ritual, scorned the hierarchy, and preached escape from the material world, was politically useless. The state needed a Christian God who demanded obedience, suffering, and sacrifice, sacrificial atonement, thereby reinforcing the legitimacy of earthly rulers and religious authorities. The Gnostic emphasis on Gnosis, secret, personal knowledge, was intolerable to the Roman Church, which relied on faith mediated through the clergy and the sacraments. Personal, secret knowledge cannot be taxed, cannot be organized, and cannot be controlled. The final, definitive act of suppression came in 367 AD with the famous Easter letter of Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria. Athanasius laid down the law. He listed the 27 books that would forever form the canon of the New Testament. All other texts, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, were designated as apocryphal and explicitly forbidden to be read or copied. This was not a recommendation, it was a military order. The imperial church used its newfound state power to enforce this canon. Over the next several centuries, countless thousands of texts deemed heretical were hunted down and committed to the flames. Possession of them was often considered a capital offense. The history of the church is not merely the history of the books it chose, but the history of the books it actively sought to destroy. The campaign against the Gospel of Judas was overwhelmingly successful. The book vanished entirely from collective memory, becoming little more than a cursed footnote in the writings of the very bishops who condemned it. The story of Judas the villain was institutionalized, codified into Western law and morality, and cemented as immutable truth. Our single copy of the Codex Tchacos only survived because, around 370 AD, just after Athanasius issued his letter, a Gnostic community buried it in the Egyptian desert. This act of internment was not for preservation but for protection, sealing it away from the fires of the state-backed church, hoping that one day their truth might re-emerge. The truth is that the history of Christianity is not the unfolding of a single divine plan, but the violent selection of one political narrative over another. The narrative that won created a villain out of a spiritual hero. The historical question is now inescapable. We have two complete narratives, one created to support authority and one created to destroy it. The unearthing of the Gospel of Judas, after its silence of 16 centuries, does not merely add a footnote to Christian history, it fundamentally redefines the act of canonization itself. It proves that the history we inherited is a product of political selection, not purely divine revelation. We are left standing on a precipice, forced to confront two mutually exclusive narratives about the greatest event in Western spiritual history. On one side stands the canonical narrative, championing atonement. It requires a Judas motivated by greed and consumed by Satan, thus making Christ's death a necessary, sacrificial payment for sin. This narrative validates the need for clergy and ritual to mediate salvation, reinforcing the power of the apostolic succession. On the other side stands the Gnostic narrative, championing liberation. It requires a Judas, motivated by Gnosis and entrusted by Christ, making his act a necessary catalyst to free the divine spirit from the material prison. This narrative validates the need for personal knowledge and spiritual rebellion, destroying the legitimacy of the institutional hierarchy. For the institutional church of the 4th century, which sought to govern millions across the Roman Empire, the choice was obvious. The Gnostic message was anarchic, intellectual, and decentralized. It offered a private spiritual path that bypassed the tithes, the bishops, and the imperial structure entirely. A church built on the Gospel of Judas would have been a school of philosophy, not an empire of power. The canonical Gospels were chosen because they created a structured system of authority. They made the founding apostles heroic, thus creating an unbroken line of power from Christ to the papacy. They insisted that the physical world was sacred, thus sanctioning the church's presence and wealth within that world. The Gospel of Judas was burned precisely because it told the opposite truth, that the founding apostles were misguided, their rituals were error, and the church itself was a servant of the false creator. The historical verdict is clear. The story of the Judas the villain was institutionally necessary. The Gospel of Judas was therefore historically expendable. The suppression of this text serves as a lasting lesson. The most profound truths are often the ones declared heresy. The books that challenge power are the ones that are buried. Our single fragmented copy of the Codex Tchacos is a testament to the fact that the spiritual battle for the true legacy of Jesus Christ was won not by miracles, but by political force and the destruction of evidence. The story of the traitor, Judas Iscariot, is merely the most dramatic casualty in the massive, sustained effort to create a single, unified, and controllable version of the faith. The ultimate question is not about the historical man Judas. It is about the choice we make now, the choice between the comfortable lie that supports the structure and the inconvenient truth that demands internal spiritual liberation. If you are compelled by these hidden histories, if you want to explore the deepest, most difficult texts that were eliminated from the Bible texts that reveal a forgotten, revolutionary, and often shocking early form of Christianity, you must join us. Do not allow the silence of the past 2 millennia to define your future understanding. Subscribe now to the Kingdom Watch Network and join the ranks of those who seek the truths that were declared forbidden. Next week, we analyze the Gospel of Thomas, the cryptic text that claims Jesus taught reincarnation, the cyclical nature of the soul, and why this doctrine was the final, unforgivable heresy for the Roman Church, forcing a permanent spiritual split between East and West. Watch closely, because the kingdom is always watched, and the truth is rarely comfortable.